Well, hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks for joining in today. My name is Robert Breitbart, Director of Educational Partnerships with Burlington English, and we have an extra special webinar coming your way. Couldn't think of a topic more topical than the one we have today, which is Demystified, Adult Education Funding. And we've got some extra dynamic presenters today with an incredible amount of not just experience, but wonderful presentation skills to, again, make complicated things as easy as possible. So once again, thank you all for taking time out of your day and joining us. A few things to go over before we kick off. First and foremost, this webinar will be recorded and will be available later this week at burlingtonenglish.com. If you go to the bottom of our website, we have our archived webinars, and you can see past webinars as well. And so if you have any colleagues that weren't able to make it today, feel free, just send them our way. Or if you get interrupted, just know that we will have this up there shortly. Also, keep in mind that you will be receiving a follow-up email from us. It will have a certificate of attendance as well as resources that our wonderful presenters have shared with us and be sharing with you. And right now, if you will, I'd really like to see that chat light up. So please feel free, share in the chat your name, what program you're with, and what city and state you're coming in from. We have a great number of people from all around the country joining in. So once again, make this a great practice of andragogy and get in there and again, light that chat up. And for the question section, please also feel free to put any questions you have, and we'll do our very best to get to them towards the end of our webinar. And for any extra powerful ones that we don't get a chance to address, we'll review them with our presenters and send out a second email to you. So with that, I've got once again, some amazing presenters. Dr. Carolyn Zachary, State Director for Adult Education there in California. And then the relatively recently retired Indiana State Director, Marilyn Pizzulo, is also going to join us. So to kick off the first part, talking about federal funding, that'll be Dr. Zachary, and then we'll transition to Marilyn Pizzulo with general state funding. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Zachary.
Thanks so much, Robert. Let me get my screen sharing here going. Screen sharing. All right, so we're going to kick this off talking about the federal appropriations process and help everyone to kind of understand what that is. Now, you all know, you probably remember how a bill became a bill, but what we don't often remember or know is how federal appropriations work. There was no Schoolhouse Rock for that. Before we get into all of this, let's do a little bit of level setting, because I know that we have a wide variety of individuals attending, as well as a multitude of states being represented. And so let's talk about how adult education is funded. Most programs have some state funding, and they also have federal funding. And the federal dollars will come from WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. What you might not know is in this federal funding under WIOA, there are 4 titles. And those 4 titles are really meant to work together. And so we have Title I, which is really that it's adult education, dislocated worker, and youth programs. Title II, of course, is US, Adult Education Family Literacy Act. Title III is Wagner-Pizer, which is really the unemployment pieces. And then Title IV is Department of Rehab, really working with adults who have barriers related to some type of a disability to work. And so all states and territories receive WIOA funding, and it varies by state and territory. And then each state should, and I'm just going to say should because not all do, should be supporting their adult education programs through some state funding as well. And that is going to vary widely across the country. And so this, I just wanted to give everyone sort of the grounding on where our money comes from for adult education, and that WIOA has different titles, just like the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act does, or Every Student Succeed Act. So similar to that. So sometimes it's confusing when you hear that they're eliminating Title III. That's not Title III WIOA, that's Title III ESSA, and that has to do with things at that K-12 level. So we're going to be talking about adults today and how we get our funding. So when we think about the federal budget and appropriations process, we have three major players, of course: the President, Congress, and then all of the federal agencies. And this annual cycle that I'm going to talk about really came into being by in 1974 with the Budget Act bill. So this is the process that's supposed to happen. The president is supposed to release their budget in early February. That budget is often prepared by the Office of Management and Budget, called OMB, and they take requests from all of the federal agencies. So in our case, we can think of Department of Education and Department of Labor, because some of those programs, some of those titles sit at the Department of Labor. And so they provide all of that information to the president, and then the president comes up with the wish list. And really that's what it is, right? It's a wish list for how they would like to see things funded and at what levels. This is not binding on Congress whatsoever, because Congress has what they say, they are the appropriators. So after that, after the president has his wish list, his budget, then there is a process that Congress can follow. Again, they don't always do this, but this gives us a general framework of what Congress does, and it's called the budget resolution process. And there's first a blueprint for spending and revenue. So this is looking at our total federal spending, our total revenue. What are we looking at when it comes to deficit and surplus levels? And then what are the spending caps for the appropriations committees? So there's some caps that are put in place. And again, this provides a framework. It doesn't do the actual funding of anything. It just gives Congress sort of a blueprint, as I've said, to follow. And if Congress can't agree on kind of this process, which often happens, they can still proceed directly to appropriations and sort of skip this whole step. So in that budget resolution process, Congress uses these tools that they call deeming resolutions that give the appropriations committees, and we'll talk about those in a moment, the authority and the spending limits that they need. And these deemers can come from a simple House or Senate rule, a provision in a previous appropriations bill, a leadership directive, or a statutory rule that activates something automatically. Again, we're not seeing a lot of Congress in the last several years going through this budget resolution process. And that's just because I think of the more dividedness right now of the legislature. And so then the next step is they have these spending caps, and they tell the appropriations committees what their spending caps are. And these committees are divided into 12 subcommittees, and they start the work on writing appropriations bills. And then they move these bills to the committee for markup, and then to the House and Senate floor. We're going to jump into this process a little more on what that looks like. But let me explain what this budget resolution process is not. One, it's not required by law. The budget resolution is not signed by the president. It doesn't become law, and it's not legally required for appropriations to occur, which is why I've said over the last many years, we have not seen Congress using this process in their determinations of spending for programs like WIOA. So let's just really look at what happens in appropriations, whether they go through the budget resolution process or not. We have appropriations bills, and this is the core of the funding and the meat of what you really need to understand. So here's the key players. You have the House and the Senate appropriations committees. Though that committee, the one in the House and the one in the Senate, are each divided into 12 subcommittees that oversee a certain area, such as defense, labor and education, agriculture, right? So we have 12 of those committees, subcommittees. Within those 12 subcommittees, Congress divides up the discretionary spending, and we'll talk about what non-discretionary spending is, into those 12 pots for the subcommittees. And within those subcommittees, they write up their bills, which is the budget bill. They set detailed funding levels for every single program and agency in their jurisdiction. And then the full committee, the full appropriations committee, goes through a markup process, and they introduce amendments and they debate over should this money be spent the way it's listed in these various sections of the budget. So the second step is, once they've done these markups, the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee, they're likely two different versions. And so now they have to reconcile those. Once they've reconciled those, then the bill goes to the floor for debate, similar to what we know on how a bill becomes a bill. And first, it usually starts in the House, and then it moves on to the Senate, although it could vary. But both chambers will vote. They'll have a final vote. Hopefully it's all positive, right? It has to be positive to move it on to the president. And then it gets moved on to the president, and the president can sign the Budget Act, or they can veto it. Now, if the president chooses to veto what Congress has provided, Congress has three options. They can override the veto with a 2/3 vote in each chamber, so in the House and the Senate. They can revise the bill because perhaps the president has given them some insight as to why it has been vetoed. So they could revise the bill and send it back for signature, or they can do nothing and the bill simply dies and they have to start over. But the goal is to pass all 12 appropriations bills by October 1st. I don't know when the last time that happened. It rarely happens on time. So if it doesn't happen on time, a couple things could happen to prevent the government from shutting down. You've heard a lot in the news about about the government shutting down at various times because Congress hasn't been able to have a bill that the president would sign. Often, what Congress will do then is they'll do a continuing resolution. They're temporarily extending last year's funding levels, and this will prevent a government shutdown. I call this kicking the can down the road. Their other option is to do an omnibus bill, and this is a single large bill bundling several or all of the appropriations bills together, or they could do a minibus bill, which is a smaller bundle with a few appropriations in it. But the one that we hear about the most is the continuing resolution. So what does this continuing resolution do? It will extend funding at the current rate, or it's called flat funding, meaning programs are going to receive roughly the same amount of funding that they had in the prior year. It could include some temporary adjustments. These are usually anomalies, and these are exceptions for programs that cannot operate at prior year levels. There might be a reason that they need more funding. There's some startup schedules or deadlines, or there's other required things that authorities have to take care of. Again, that's kind of rare. But what all of this does is it prevents a shutdown. This is what a continuing resolution cannot do. They can't create new programs. They can't increase program funding unless there's that anomaly. They cannot implement new policies and appropriations, and it cannot replace the need for a regular appropriations bill. So they can kick the can down the road as many times as Congress deems necessary, but sooner or later, they have to come up with an appropriations bill. Now, when I talked earlier about the 12 subcommittees and the fact that they have authority over the discretionary spending, that is roughly 1/3 of the federal budget. There is mandatory spending that they don't have, that doesn't have to go through this annual appropriations process, which we might all be glad about. And that's things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They don't have to go through this process because they're governed by separate laws. So budget, let's talk about this budget reconciliation. How can Congress get to the point where they can agree on a budget and ensure that we're moving forward? Again, this isn't used every year, but it's important. And what it does is it allows Congress to change taxes, mandatory spending, and the debt limit. And in this process, it cannot be filibustered in the Senate. And it matters because reconciliation bills only have to pass with 51 votes in the Senate, making them powerful tools for major policy changes. So sometimes you will hear that the Senate wants to do a budget reconciliation so that they can get something moving fast. Again, it doesn't happen every year, but these are things you may hear about in the news. And then the next step is, now let's say we got our budget, followed the process, and now these appropriations become law. And agencies spend the funds consistent with Congress's direction. The Office of Management and Budget, as well as agency fiscal officers, monitor the execution of it. And then we also have the inspectors general, the Government Accounting Office, and Congress, who then provides some oversight. So again, Congress is where appropriations happen, and then at the department or agency level is where the funds are then sent out. So if we think about WIOA funding, excuse me, WIOA is funded through the annual Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education. So it's often called Labor HHS Education Subcommittee. And WIOA funding is discretionary funding, meaning that Congress must renew it every year through this appropriations process. Now here comes the confusing part. So WIOA Title II is what's called forward funded. So Congress appropriates the money during a federal fiscal year. And a federal fiscal year starts October 1st and ends September 30th. So if we think about the current year that we're in fiscal year 26. It started October 1st and it will end September 30th. WIOA Title II funding doesn't begin to use, WIOA Title II doesn't begin to use those funds until months later in what we call our program year 26, or you can think of it as a school year. So it's July 1, 2026 to June 30th, 2027. That is one of the more confusing pieces of all of this budget process, because we're always having to think, what fiscal year are we in and what program year? And what fiscal year is Congress working on and what program year will be affected? So it's always a little tricky piece. And so I always like to remind individuals of this so that you have it clear in your head, because a couple things happen during the year that can affect this. So if we look at what happened for fiscal year 2026, so this is our program year funding for July 1, 2026 to June 30th, 2027. So back in 2025, the president proposed $0 for adult education family literacy. The House Appropriations Committee followed that and also put 0 in their budget. The Senate Appropriations response was level funding. Eventually, they got to an agreement that was passed in Congress on February 3rd, which was level funding. President signed that also on February 3rd. So that is funding for the next academic year, starting July 1. So let's look at the next step, right? So now we're going to be talking about fiscal year 2027, which is for program year July 1, 2027 to June 30th, 2028. Now, the president missed his deadline to submit in February. He finally released his budget, remember his wish list, on April 3rd. And again, we were zeroed out. Just so you know, no president has ever met that February deadline since 2015. So this is not unusual. And so what happens next is that we go through that appropriations process. And a lot of that will begin happening probably in May and June. I do know that I heard that Labor, HHS, Education in the House Committee was going to start meeting on marking up their budgets the beginning of June. So if you're interested in seeing what that's like, you can get onto their subcommittee webpage and find the schedule and watch that live because it's live streamed. Let's talk a little bit about, we're going to shift a little bit here and talk about reauthorization for WIOA, because this is another area that everyone is curious about and wondering what's happening. The House Republicans brought forth a reauthorization bill, and two things in this bill, most of the bill was very similar to what was in the reauthorization bill that almost passed last December and got pulled out at the very last minute. The one change that's major in this bill is that it permanently moves adult education, WIOA Title II, to the Department of Labor. There was a markup hearing on this bill on last Tuesday, April 21st, and I know that the link to, you can watch that hearing is going to be put in the chat. And this bill is not likely to pass with moving Title II to the Department of Labor. From listening to that hearing, there was great opposition to that move. But I always like to look for the silver lining, and I like to think that this was a starting place. So hopefully we can get WIOA reauthorization in the near future. And so now Marilyn is going to pick up here and talk about some additional reflections on what this means for you and what you can be doing in your states. Marilyn?
Thank you, Carolyn. That was really helpful. And I hope everybody will go back and look over those slides again and again and again, because it's one of those things that you have to see it several times before it really sinks in. Though, the one thing I want to say about WIOA reauthorization before I take over here is, why is it important, right? Why do we care if WIOA is reauthorized? And if you've been around for a little while, you know that we have not been authorized for many years. We've run out the clock on our original authorization. And some would say that it makes things a little tenuous for us when we do not have a current bill that authorizes us. So that's why we tie funding often with this idea of WIOA reauthorization. And it's not just for us, it's for all the titles of WIOA. We all are in kind of a similar boat together when we talk about that. So I just have a few additional reflections, and I'm going to give you a caveat before I start that I am the former state director. So things could have changed in Indiana since I left last fall, but I'm going to give you some perspective on state funding based on where things were when I left. So many of you, as Carolyn said, you have state funding as well as federal funding. For some states, like Indiana, 60% of adult education funding is state. Only 40% of what goes to providers is actually federal dollars. In other states, that's completely opposite, or that state funding piece is almost non-existent. We're looking at like a 95% federal versus a 5% state. You need to understand where you are, where your state is. Kind of in that calculation. Sorry, Robert, I was looking at your note. So that's the first thing that I would say to you. It's really important for you to understand what your state funding is as well. Know your budget, know where you can flex. I'm going to go back to state budgets for just a second. I remembered something that they wanted me to share. Often, and this is still the case in some places, state allocations or allocations in general are done based on truly just kind of enrollment numbers, or as we used to say in Indiana, butts in seats. It was just based on that. And over the years, that allocation formula for many states, and I would say probably most, has changed. And it has become somewhat performance-based. In Indiana, while there might be a base funding, there's a large portion of the dollars in Indiana that goes to providers is based on their performance from the previous year. That Correct, Robert. Yeah. I'm referring to funding allocation by your state legislature rather than the federal. So you have two pots of money in most states. Even if that pot is very small, the state pot is very small. You have two pots of money going to your state that's funding local programs. So again, this can be different from state to state, but what we are seeing in the general trend is that a lot of our allocations now are based on some sort of formula for some sort of performance. And I would say, looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to see that more and more. So performance, and you're getting this money, and what is the outcomes based on the money that you're getting, however your state determines they want to do that. Those things are very important. So you need to understand how your state is choosing to allocate funding to you. Is it still based on the number of enrollments you have? I would doubt it, but you can check on that. That's quite possible. So once you get your money from the state, know your budget and know where you can flex. We're in an environment right now where we have money and we need to use it wisely. We need to be very good stewards. Unfortunately, I hear too often, well, my state or my program sent back this money. Ouch. We don't want to be there. We want to be good stewards. We don't want to misuse or misappropriate funds, but we don't want to send funds back. We know we can look at the numbers, whether it's PIAC or any other survey out there, and we know that the need is there. We need to be good stewards about using those dollars and not sending those back. So how can you flex that? That's something as a local program director, you should be looking at on a regular basis. I'm going to pause here for just a second. Did we lose Carolyn?
No, hang on. It flipped to something.
Okay.
And there we go.
Thank you. Okay.
Things came in and opened.
So you need to know your budget. You need to know where you can flex. What are things that you can, you don't need to have a fire sale at the end of the year. You should be doing a really good job of managing your budgets, but are there things that you're allowed to purchase under federal regulations and your state regulations that you can use in subsequent years? Know those things. Know how you can flex with those money. Know what your priorities are for your state. In Indiana, the priority is credentials, certifications, and workplace classes. Many talk about this as being workplace literacy. In Indiana, you will hear us refer to it as WEI, Workforce Education Initiative. Those two things are really priorities in the state of Indiana. So if I was a program in Indiana, I would want to focus and make sure that I'm getting the most bang for my buck out of those IETs and workplace classes. Again, classes that are on site with employers, not just I'm teaching interviewing skills. I'm going to want to make sure that I am getting the most that I can out of that, and I might want to cut something else if budgets require that. Education and advocacy. So when I was a state staff person, because of requirements from the Department of Education, I did not advocate for adult education. I educated legislators and key stakeholders about adult education. However, those of you that are not under that, you can advocate. And the magic really happens at the local level. We have great partners in COABE that are really doing wonderful work at advocating at a high level at the national level. I would say, going back to that idea of the split between your budget, if you're a state that has a lot of state dollars, the focus of your advocacy really needs to be at the state level. And the best way for that state advocacy to take place is through local programs connecting with local legislators. So make sure that you are doing those things that COABE tells you about, inviting your legislator, whether it's a state or federal legislator. Are you inviting them to your graduations? Are you sending them reports on your performance and the wonderful things that you're doing? Are you sharing student success stories? Advocacy is two parts. It is data, hard data. It is student success stories. Those two things together are what can really move the needle when it comes to advocacy. Next steps, I think Robert, posted a PowerPoint that I did at COABE, and I left some next steps in there for everybody as far as really learning about the workforce system as a whole. Hopefully, we don't see major transitions, but what we are seeing is the focus of adult education pivoting away from education just for that pure purpose and more of a workforce focus. So how are you partnering with your workforce partners? What do you know about them? How can you build those relationships stronger to benefit both of you, where you're advocating together for these resources? I suggest that you go get to know a job coach in your American Job Center. Take them to lunch, buy them donuts, become their best friend, learn what it is that they do and what the metrics are that they're being held to, and then figure out how you can come in and partner with them. But I'll say this again, the magic in advocacy happens at the local level. It then builds from there. It was a local program that had our state senator, Todd Young, first come to it, that moved the needle on Senator Young becoming a strong advocate for adult education. And I think, yes, Robert, partners, there are partners outside of your American Job Centers, like your Perkins partners and your SNAP TANF partners. Any of those folks, working to build stronger relationships with them that's kind of the direction that we're seeing the focus of WIOA moving to. Anything that you're going to do that's going to tie to that, I think will be helpful in advocacy that will ultimately result in additional funding. And I think with that, Robert, I'm going to close and I'm going to kick it back to you and Carolyn.
Thanks, Marilyn. I really appreciate that the state approach and the information that you shared. Robert, I know you have some questions.
Yes. I think that the term, like we were talking about partners, but then just in general, with adult education, who's out there that even if you just talk about in a nutshell, that we might be able to force maximize, that they work with a lot of the same folks that we do, and therefore, and that we have a great possibility for synergy. So, for instance, what I used to know when I was a little kid is the unemployment office, and now might be Ohio Means Jobs or India, Michigan Works, so Career Source Florida. So, what are some examples of partnerships that you've either seen personally in your state or heard about, for example, like American Job Centers and adult education?
So I'll jump in really quickly. In Indiana, they're called the Work Ones. They have our Title I and our Title III services. Title I in or Title III in Indiana is Wagner Pizer, as you got the primer on earlier. That is our career services. And those services are pretty much open to just about everybody. You can get Title III services without having to jump through a lot of hoops. How can you partner with them for them to do some of their workshops in your adult education program, whether it's resume writing, interviewing? We have a great one on, we have a large Crane Naval Center here. They do a great webinar on how do you get into federal jobs. So having them come to do some of those kind of presentations. And then also your SNAP, and some of our states are great at this, your SNAP 50/50 partners and coming together to do some of that education and training as a partnership, I think is another one at the big level that we need to do a better job with.
And I'll just add that certainly with some of the new work requirements that are going to be going into effect starting June 1st for individuals who are on SNAP, on Medicaid, those different support services that they're receiving, education is a key component in that. And that's where we can come to the table to ensure that we're working with those other state agencies to reduce the number of people that are going to lose those benefits that have been helping to support them.
And Robert, one final one that I think we all need to really become best friends with is our Perkins CTE partnerships. There are many adult education programs that are already in CTE centers, but there are also that many more that are not and do not have that partnership. And I do think as we try to read the tea leaves on the direction that we're going here, you're going to see more and more potential funding that could come out for those folks that are doing that kind of work. And then finally, big elephant in the room, apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships.
And just in a quick nutshell, because I know there's been quite a few webinars and discussion, if for those of you out there, if you're also not plugged into resources such as, Amanda Burks and Shilcock with
National Skills Coalition.
National Skills Coalition. So, and I'll put that in the chat as well, but check out National Skills Coalition as well. They do a fantastic job of, in a nutshell, explaining a lot of the things we're talking about. So, just real quick, of course, when I was a kid, something we might have known as welfare, is the supplemental nutrition, is the SNAP, and then there's TANF. And thanks, Amy G, in the chat. And I got to admit, for years, when I first started adult ed, I thought it was E and as in Nancy T, but it's E and then ampersand T, education and training. So obviously somebody getting assistance can continue to do that, but they have some requirements to get this type of assistance. And that could be through adult education, ladies.
That's correct.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So Indiana has been a little behind as far as many of our adult education providers becoming education and training providers under SNAP 50/50. And what SNAP 50/50 does, separate really from E&T, SNAP 50/50, there is funding available to help offset the cost of training. So if you can receive, it's a reimbursement type program, but you can receive up to 50% of those training costs back for eligible SNAP recipients. Yeah, great. That's the link. That's the link you want to go to. But we're seeing more expansion on that in Indiana, providers trying to really take hold of this as a way to supplement funding.
And then also even for, is it Medicare or Medicaid? There's also a stronger requirement now for education and training. Maybe you can talk just briefly about that.
So I believe that there are where it was is there were work requirements, and I believe it's 80 hours a month, a requirement that's going into place. And in most states, I believe adult education qualifies as that training, and most of your credential training will qualify as well.
Yes, that's correct. And they've expanded the age range for what are called able-bodied adults without dependents. And so now it's up, I don't know the high end, I think it's in the 60s, that if you're receiving assistance then and you're in your 60s, you still are expected to be working 20 hours a week or receiving education and training, education or training.
Don't quote me exactly, but I think it went from 57, the age of 57 to 62.
Yes, I think you're correct.
Yeah. And so if I were at the local level, where might I reach out to start a discussion with some of these partners you're talking about, whether it's SNAP or Medicaid or?
At the
Well,
local,
Carol, go ahead.
okay, I was going to say at the local level, I would certainly make sure that you are best friends with your America's Job Center folks, because that's where you can start with those connections. And then certainly your local Health and Human Services, whatever it might be called at your local level, as well as your local workforce board.
There you go.
And we are in California, we require that all of our subrecipients, even if there are multiple subrecipients within a local board region, that they're all a member of that local board. So being a member of the local board is a requirement. And so that is something, another place where adult education can really talk about the benefits that we offer and how we partner and can share, and we actually share most of these individuals, and that we shouldn't be as siloed as we are. And that's one place to start breaking down some of those silos.
This is a great example of how states are just a hair different, right? So in Indiana, every workforce board is required to have at least one adult education Title II provider on their workforce board. So not all of them would be, but we have regional consortia of adult education providers. So we have a provider that represents that group of providers on that local workforce board. But that is a great place to meet and connect with post-secondary partners, CTE partners, Health and Human Services, all of those folks that are part of that workforce system.
Excellent. I think now, from the begin with the end in mind, not only for what the goals, particularly back to Maryland or Carolyn, Dr. Carolyn's side, which is for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. I heard it So for most of you during the year, if you hear it's time to write the grant, that's going to typically mean for most programs, it's time to do your federal RFP that your state office is putting out. And I think I've heard it best that it's like a small business loan. Here's why we need the money. Here's what we're going to do with it. And here's where we're going to pay you back. But instead of paying back, I pay you back through performance. So would either one of you like to talk about what are the biggest things I need to be thinking about as far as the federal dollars, as far as what does the federal government want to see, as far as performance, if you had to come up with a dashboard or whatever, or maybe the WIOA common measures. So what are the top pillars of what the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, OCTAE at the federal level, is looking for?
Well, I would say even beyond just OCTAE, I would say OCTAE and Department of Labor, they're really looking for individuals to get a job. I mean, we are an education program within a workforce bill. And so one of our common metrics is, did an individual receive a job, get employed 6 months after they left a program, doesn't matter which title, 6 months after they left a program, and 12 months after they left a program. And what was their median age, or not wage, medium wage, median wage. And again, with WIOA Title II, we always are looking at skills gains, as our other partners are as well. But our skills gains are, those educational functioning levels and students earning a high school diploma or equivalency, or any other type of a credential. Doing a workplace milestone is now becoming more in Title II, where as we're partnering with our local workforce and setting up milestones for individuals. But really the common pieces that everyone is looking at is those employment indicators.
And I would say, I heard this from someone else, but performance is the best advocacy. And so anything that you can do to improve your outcomes for your students, and that might be, it might not be that you're not doing the right things with those students, but maybe you aren't tracking it in the right ways. You're not doing follow up in a way that is getting you those employment outcomes. You might think about ways that you can improve getting that data that would then improve your performance.
And I'll just add on to that. This isn't a data webinar, so we won't go into the weeds on that. But if you look at your students and that you have had in your program, and if you do a pre-test and a post-test, or you have some type of other outcome, high school diploma, high school equivalency, if you're using that as your measure, looking at the other NRS tables, the National Reporting System tables, other than Table 4 by itself. Because if you look at Table 4, our outcomes are based on 100% of our participants. And when we hear that we aren't effective, coming from the government, coming from the president, well, if you only had someone in your program for 12, 13, 14 hours, that's not a very long time to help them make an educational functioning level gain. But if we look at the average number of hours of instruction, which the national average is about 129 hours of instruction, we don't know how many gains a student could make in that time. But in California, you have to have about 70 hours of instruction before you do a post-test. That's less than 2 weeks of work. And an individual can make an educational functioning level gain. And so if you look at those students that you've actually had time to give them instruction and education and training, we do very well. And we aren't ineffective. We are very effective with a measurable skill gain nationally in the mid 70s. So I would say that looking at your data from different angles, looking at different measurable skill gains, and really using that in any advocacy efforts that you're going to do.
And by the way, I think the folks in Hollywood and TV call this a teaser. So if for those of you out there, just know we are going to be doing a future where we delve a little deeper into this. So one thing I'd like to point out that I popped in the chat is that these other partners that also are funded through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, like your American Job Center, they have the exact same WIOA common measures as we do in Title II, Chapter 2, if you will. If legislation's a book, we're the second chapter, Title II. And so I've popped in the chat the WIOA common measures. So just know if you haven't had a lot of experience talking with your partners, like the American Job Centers, just know they speak our language. They speak the language that our presenters were talking about, helping people get jobs, keep jobs, transition to post-secondary, getting certificates and so on and so forth. So I've popped that in. And then the last thing, as we wrap this up, I think that if I were back at the local level, I would want to find out as much as possible, as particularly Dr. Carolyn just alluded to, which is the way that the performance of programs in your state get from your state capital to the federal government as part of the agreement to receive WIOA funds. That, of course, for many of you, I'm telling you, water's wet and snow is cold. That's called the National Reporting System. And I would highly recommend that you take a look. And I've included this also in the PowerPoint that you're going to get as well. So I would definitely bookmark the link that we just provided. Thank you very much, Marilyn, for that. So again, keep in mind that as the federal government, regardless of who's in power, who's holding the White House or Congress, just know that the way that they're judging effectiveness is through typically through the data, unless they're hopefully invited to our local programs and they're seeing all the amazing things that we're doing. And take a look at the page that I just put in. Find out as much as possible about your NRS data. And as Dr. Carolyn said, for not just, of course, for test gains, but for things such as job placements and checking then back for, do those individuals that we serve still have those jobs? Have they gone on to further training? And so that you can get a lot of that in the NRS. Yes. Ladies, any last things as we come to a fantastic, and by the way, thank you so much. I've been getting so many texts that this is just one of the best webinars, but some other things you'd like to leave people with of maybe hot topics they should be paying attention to through other websites?
I just saw something that Jeff left in the chat, and I just wanted to say this. I said it during my COABE presentation. We do not have to segregate foundational skills from workforce skills. Foundational skills are workforce skills. And I think that that is something that we need to help educate our key stakeholders on. You can't get to credential training if you don't have those foundational skills. And so they are required for workforce as well.
Great.
I don't have anything to add, Marilyn. I think that was great.
Yeah, so with that, thank you very, very much. I'll move on to my next slide here. Thank you very much to our presenters. Just incredible job. It just made it super understandable and clear. Once again, a recording of this webinar will be available at burlingtonenglish.com in just a day or two. We have archives of all of our webinars from the past. You'll be getting, once again, an email with a certificate of attendance along with all the resources and links that we mentioned. And as always, we here at Burlington English, our incredible team, almost 100 folks out there in the field, are here to assist you. Please reach out, burlingtonenglish.com. /contact. So with that, Robert Breitbart, want to thank once again Dr. Carolyn Zachary from the great state of California, and then Marilyn Pizzullo from Indiana. Thanks for all of your wonderful information that you shared. All right, everybody. Thanks for doing all you do. Take good care. Bye-bye now.